The village lay in a quiet valley, wrapped in the kind of mist that softened even the sharpest corners of memory. It was late autumn. The hedgerows were thinning, the fields already harvested, and the scent of damp leaves lingered everywhere. Margaret lived at the edge of the village, in a small cottage that had seen generations pass. She had turned 70 that spring, though she rarely said it aloud. Her husband had been gone for almost a decade. She'd learned to live with the silence, until Daniel came back. Daniel was her son-in-law, or had been. Her daughter Lucy had left him the year before. Margaret didn't blame him, nor did she blame her daughter. Marriages sometimes crumble quietly, like frost melting off the window. When Daniel wrote from London saying he needed a place to stay, just for a while, Margaret agreed before she had time to think. It felt natural, almost comforting, to offer her spare room to someone she still thought of as family. When Daniel arrived, the village seemed to wake a little. He was 30, tall, with a kind of quiet energy that made you notice him even when he said nothing. He brought few belongings, just a suitcase and a worn leather satchel. "You haven't changed," he said when she opened the door, though she saw the surprise in his eyes. She had changed. Her hair was whiter now, her hands thinner, but her eyes still held their old brightness, like the reflection of a candle in glass. They fell into a rhythm easily. Daniel chopped wood in the mornings and helped her with repairs around the garden. Margaret made tea and pretended not to notice how often he smiled at her jokes, or how the air seemed to thicken slightly when they sat too close by the fire. At first she told herself it was nothing. A remnant of affection, perhaps, born from the intimacy of shared loneliness. But then came the evening of the storm. The rain had started suddenly, beating against the windows in heavy bursts. The electricity flickered, then died. Daniel lit a candle and set it between them on the table. Its flame danced wildly, throwing shadows across the room. They were eating soup, Margaret's potato and leek, and laughing about how old-fashioned it felt to dine by candlelight. When the wind howled through the chimney, Margaret shivered, and Daniel instinctively reached across the table, touching her hand. It was a simple gesture, comfort, warmth, but his fingers lingered a second too long. She looked up, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain and their breathing, shallow, uncertain. "You'll catch cold," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. He rose, walked around the table, and pulled the shawl from the back of her chair, draping it gently around her shoulders. She could feel the heat of him standing behind her, the faint scent of wood smoke and rain. Her heart, long dormant, steady, untroubled, gave an unexpected flutter. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. He hesitated. "You shouldn't thank me for something so small." "It's not small," she replied. "Not when one's forgotten what it's like to be cared for." That silenced him. He sat again, his eyes studying her with a tenderness that felt almost dangerous. It was not desire, not yet, something quieter, deeper. Recognition. A sense that both of them had found something they hadn't known they were missing. Later that night, when the storm had passed and Daniel had gone upstairs, Margaret stood by the window, looking out into the dark. The garden glistened under the wet moonlight, and in the reflection of the glass she saw her own face. Older, lined, yet alive in a way she hadn't seen for years. She touched her cheek, wondering what he had seen in her expression when their eyes met. Over the next days, something unspoken began to build between them. They never crossed any line, but everything, the way he poured her tea, the way she brushed crumbs from his sleeve, felt charged. The world outside the cottage seemed to fade. It was only the two of them, living in a strange, suspended time. One morning, as she arranged flowers from the garden, Daniel came in from chopping wood. His hair was damp with sweat, his shirt clinging slightly to his chest. She turned quickly, pretending not to notice the sudden rush of warmth to her face. "You're working too hard," she said. "I like it," he replied. "It keeps my mind quiet." "And what do you think about when it's not quiet?" He smiled faintly. "You don't want to know." But she did. She wanted to ask him to know everything. His thoughts, his loneliness, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Yet she said nothing. It was easier to live in silence than to risk the truth. That evening, he brought her a book from the shelf, an old collection of poems she hadn't opened in years. "I found this upstairs," he said. "Do you still read them?" "Sometimes," she answered. "When I'm brave enough." He raised an eyebrow. "Brave? Poetry is dangerous," she said, half smiling. "It reminds you of everything you've tried to forget." He laughed softly, then opened the book at random. His voice, low and warm, filled the room as he began to read. The poem was about autumn, about age, about love that lingers long after youth has gone. Margaret closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. She felt the tremor in her hands, the quickened pulse she could no longer deny. When he finished, there was a long silence. The fire crackled softly. "That was beautiful," she said. "It was," he agreed, watching her. "You make it more so." She wanted to scold him, to remind him that she was old enough to be his grandmother, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she turned back to the fire, her cheeks warm, her heart alive with something she hadn't felt in decades. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the floorboards creak above her. His footsteps slow, uncertain. For a moment she imagined him stopping by her door, knocking softly, whispering her name. But he didn't. The silence returned, heavy and thick, and she drifted to sleep with his voice, reading poetry, still echoing in her mind. Winter came quietly, slipping into the valley with its silver mornings and long blue shadows. Frost traced delicate lace along the windowpanes of Margaret's cottage, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and distant fields asleep under snow. Daniel stayed on. What was meant to be a few weeks had stretched into months. Neither of them spoke about it. Some things were easier left unnamed. They lived side by side as though bound by a secret rhythm. In the mornings, he chopped wood or fixed the fences that had long been forgotten. She cooked, knitted, and pretended her hands didn't tremble when he brushed past her in the narrow kitchen. It was a simple life, and yet every moment felt sharpened, alive with something unspoken. One Sunday, the village held its winter fair. Margaret hadn't gone in years, but Daniel insisted. "You can't hide away all season," he said, smiling. "You need a bit of laughter, a bit of warmth." She almost refused, but his eyes were kind, persuasive. "All right," she said at last. "But only if you promise not to let me fall on the ice." He offered his arm with mock ceremony. "I wouldn't dare." The village square was bright with ribbons and lights. Children skated on the frozen pond, their laughter ringing through the crisp air. Margaret felt shy at first, aware of every glance, every whispered greeting. People knew who Daniel was. They knew he'd once been Lucy's husband. But gossip was a kind of background noise here, you learned to live with it. Still, when she caught Mrs. Turner's disapproving stare, she felt a flush creep up her neck. Daniel noticed. Without a word, he took her hand and led her toward the stalls, where the scent of roasted chestnuts and mulled cider hung thick in the cold. "Let them talk," he murmured. "They always do." She looked at him, half smiling. "You don't care what they think." "Not anymore." That evening, back at the cottage, the air felt heavy with something she couldn't name. She sat by the fire, removing her gloves slowly, her fingers numb from the cold. Daniel poured 2 cups of cider, the steam rising between them like a veil. "I had a good time," he said. "You seemed happy." "I was," she admitted softly. "It's been a long time since I felt that way." He sat opposite her, watching the flames. "You deserve more than loneliness, Margaret." His words struck her like a chord she hadn't dared to hear. "Loneliness is safe," she said after a pause. "No one can take it from you." "Maybe," he replied, leaning forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "But it doesn't make you feel alive." The room grew quiet. The fire crackled. She could feel her pulse in her throat. There was a fragility in the air, as though one wrong word might shatter everything. She stood abruptly and went to the window, pretending to look at the falling snow. Her reflection met his in the glass. Two shapes, one shadowed by age, the other by longing. "Daniel," she whispered, "this is foolish." "What is?" "This, whatever it is between us. You're young. You have a future. I'm." He rose, crossing the room in 3 steps. "You're everything I need," he said quietly. "Do you really think I care about numbers?" His nearness stole her breath. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could hear the faint hitch in his breathing. But she turned away, gripping the windowsill until her knuckles whitened. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't." He stopped, his expression breaking, half hurt, half understanding. Then slowly he stepped back. "All right," he said softly. "I'm sorry." The silence that followed was thick, unbearable. She wanted to speak, to explain that it wasn't disgust she felt. It was fear. Fear of what people would say. Fear of wanting something she had no right to want. Fear of how alive she felt when he was near. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in her chair by the fire until dawn, watching the shadows crawl across the room. Somewhere upstairs, she could hear him turning restlessly in his bed. The house seemed too small for the both of them, too full of everything unsaid. The next day, Daniel announced he would go to London for a week to settle a few things. Margaret nodded, pretending it didn't matter. She even smiled, though her chest felt hollow. When he left, the cottage grew unbearably quiet. She tried to fill the silence with small things, baking bread, sweeping the floor, reading by the fire, but the absence of his voice lingered in every corner. Each evening, she found herself listening for footsteps that never came. And when the post arrived, she opened every letter with trembling hands, half hoping one might be from him. None were. Then one morning she found him standing at the gate. His hair was damp from rain, his coat unbuttoned. "I couldn't stay away," he said simply. "I missed you." Her heart stumbled. "Daniel, you shouldn't have come back." He smiled, weary and soft. "And yet here I am." They stood there, in the grey drizzle, the fields behind them misted with fog. She wanted to tell him to leave, to run before it went too far. But she couldn't. Instead, she stepped aside and let him in. That evening the fire burned low. They sat closer than before, their knees almost touching. The room smelled of rain and pine wood. Neither spoke much. Every so often their eyes met, and something wordless passed between them, something that trembled like light across water. At last Margaret said quietly, "You're making this very difficult." He looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "So are you." She smiled then, a sad small smile. "Because I don't stop you. Because you don't want to." The truth of it hung between them, heavy and sweet. She reached for her tea, but her hand shook, and he caught it, steadying her fingers in his. The touch was brief, innocent, yet it felt like the world had tilted slightly off its axis. When she looked up, his gaze held hers with quiet intensity. "I think I should go to bed," she murmured, pulling her hand away. "Of course," he said, though his eyes didn't move from her face. She rose slowly, the weight of her years pressing on her knees. At the doorway she turned. "Good night, Daniel." He nodded. "Good night, Margaret." But when she climbed the stairs, she could feel his eyes on her, gentle, longing, and impossibly kind. That night, her dreams were full of voices, half-forgotten laughter, and the warmth of a hand she dared not hold. The days began to lengthen, though the air still carried the chill of winter. Snowdrops appeared in the garden first, then crocuses, small bursts of color against the fading frost. Margaret tended to them each morning, kneeling in the damp soil, her hands stiff from the cold. Sometimes she would glance toward the house and see Daniel watching her through the window. He never waved, but the sight of him there, his face softened by the glass, filled her with something she dared not name. Life inside the cottage had changed since his return. It wasn't anything obvious. The air simply felt charged, as though the house itself was listening. They spoke carefully now, each word chosen with a kind of trembling patience. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, alive, humming like a taut string that could snap with the slightest touch. One afternoon, as a light rain tapped against the windows, Daniel came in from the fields with mud on his boots and a wild look in his eyes. "You shouldn't be out there in this weather," she said gently, rising to take his coat. He smiled. "You worry too much." "Someone has to," she replied, hanging the coat by the door. When she turned back, he was closer than she expected. So close that she could see the droplets of rain still clinging to his hair. Their eyes met, hers lined and cautious, his bright and restless. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I can't keep pretending." Her breath caught. "Pretending what?" "That I don't think about you. Every day. Every night." The words seemed to echo in the small room. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the window, a soft percussion to the chaos in her chest. "Daniel," she began, but the sound of his name on her lips broke something inside her. All the walls she had built, of age, propriety, shame, crumbled like paper in the rain. He took her hand gently, as though afraid she might vanish. "Tell me you don't feel it," he whispered. "Tell me to stop, and I will." She looked at their joined hands. His young fingers wrapped around her thin, wrinkled ones. They should have looked wrong together. But they didn't. They looked inevitable. "I've tried not to," she said softly. "God knows I've tried." The silence that followed was the purest kind. No fear, no hesitation. Just truth. When he stepped closer, she didn't move away. His hand came to rest lightly against her cheek, his thumb brushing the fine lines there. "You're beautiful," he murmured almost to himself. She laughed then, a quiet, broken laugh. "Don't be foolish." "I'm not," he said. "I've never been more certain of anything." Margaret's heart ached with the weight of his sincerity. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, fading quietly into the background of her own life. And now, here he was, looking at her as though she were something rare, something precious. It frightened her. It thrilled her. "You don't understand what you're doing," she whispered. "I do," he said simply. "For once I do." The rain outside thickened, blurring the world beyond the windows. The fire crackled softly behind them, filling the air with warmth and the faint scent of pine. She wanted to speak, to reason, to draw a line that could not be crossed, but her voice betrayed her. He leaned in slowly, carefully, as though giving her every chance to stop him. He didn't. When his lips brushed her forehead, it was a whisper of a touch, gentle, reverent, filled with everything they hadn't said. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of recognition, of gratitude, of love that had found them when neither had been looking. When he finally drew back, she kept her eyes closed, afraid that if she opened them, the moment would shatter. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Because I can't not," he said. "Because you make me feel whole." She stepped away then, trembling. "This isn't right. People wouldn't understand." "Let them talk," he said. "Let the world judge. I'm tired of living by what others expect." "You're 30, Daniel. You could still." "Still what?" he interrupted. "Find someone younger. Start again." "I don't want to start again. I want you." The simplicity of his words left her undone. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "You're cruel," she whispered. "To make me feel this way again." He shook his head. "No. I'm trying to remind you that you're alive." She turned away, her shoulders shaking. For years she had believed that love was something that ended quietly, something that belonged only to the young. Yet here it was, reborn in her twilight years, unexpected, impossible, and utterly real. He moved closer once more, but this time he didn't reach for her. Instead, he stood beside her, watching the rain slide down the glass. After a long silence, he said, "You don't have to decide anything now. Just let this be. Let us be." She nodded, unable to trust her voice. They stood like that for a long time, side by side, their reflections merging in the window, two silhouettes bound by something neither could name. That night the house felt different. Lighter somehow. She went to bed early but couldn't sleep. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the soft rustle of wine through the chimney, made her heart race. She thought of his words, his eyes, the way his hand had felt in hers. Sometime past midnight, she rose and went to the window. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting silver light across the fields. And there, in the garden below, she saw him, standing by the gate, looking up at the sky as if waiting for a sign. Without thinking, she opened the window. The cold air rushed in, biting her skin, clearing her thoughts. "Daniel," she called softly. He turned, startled, then smiled faintly. "I couldn't sleep." "Nor could I," she said. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the distance. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand in a small wave. He mirrored the gesture, his smile widening, warm and sad and full of wonder. When she closed the window again, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. Whatever tomorrow brought, judgment, regret, longing, she would face it, because for the first time in decades she felt alive. And that, she thought as she climbed back into bed, was worth everything. Spring came early that year. The fields turned green almost overnight, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. The cottage, once so still, seemed to breathe again, windows open, curtains fluttering, birds nesting in the eaves. Life was returning to the world, and with it came a strange, aching joy that Margaret didn't quite know what to do with. Daniel stayed. He worked in the garden, repaired the roof, painted the door. Neighbors began to talk, of course, as people in small villages always did. They noticed how often he was seen walking beside her, carrying baskets from the market, how his laughter lingered in her garden long after dusk. At first, Margaret tried to ignore it. But gossip has a way of seeping through cracks, no matter how tightly you shut the windows. One afternoon, her old friend Edith came to visit, cheeks flushed with something more than the spring air. "People are talking, Margaret," she said, setting down her teacup with a clink. "You must know that." Margaret smiled faintly. "People always talk, Edith. It keeps them entertained." "This is different," Edith insisted. "He's your son-in-law, or was." "It isn't right." "Was," Margaret said softly. "Not is. And he's been kind to me, that's all." Edith's eyes softened, though her tone did not. "Kindness is one thing. But the way he looks at you." Margaret didn't reply. She didn't need to. The truth was there, unspoken but alive between every heartbeat. When Edith left, the house felt quieter than usual, not empty but contemplative, as though even the walls were thinking. That evening, she found Daniel in the garden, mending a broken trellis. The light was fading, warm and golden, and his hands were steady despite the wind. She stood watching him for a long time before speaking. "They're talking," she said at last. He didn't look up. "I know. And it doesn't bother you." He set down the hammer, wiped his hands, and finally met her gaze. "It used to. But not anymore. I stopped living for other people's comfort a long time ago." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "It's different for me. I've lived here my whole life. I can't just." He reached out, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to explain. I understand." But she could see in his eyes that it hurt him, the restraint, the endless waiting for a love that dared not show its face in daylight. That night, neither of them could sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind, to the creak of the stairs, to the distant sound of his footsteps pacing in the room above. And just before dawn, she made a decision. When she came down to breakfast, he was already there, staring into his cup as if it might reveal an answer. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. He looked up, alert. "About what?" "About us. About what happens next." He waited. "I can't keep pretending this is nothing," she said. "But I also can't keep hiding." His eyes softened. "Then don't." "I'm 70, she said, almost laughing. "Do you know what that means in a place like this? They'll never understand." "Then let them fail to understand," he said simply. "We'll live anyway." Something in his voice, calm, steady, full of quiet conviction, broke the last of her fear. She sat down across from him, the morning light falling gently across the table. "Do you really love me?" she asked. He smiled, not the eager smile of youth but the steady one of someone who had already made his choice. "I don't love you because of your years," he said. "I love you because when I'm with you, I see the world the way it should be. Honest, unhurried, real." Tears filled her eyes. She had imagined this kind of love once, long ago, before time and grief had softened her into someone quieter, smaller. She had thought it was gone forever. Yet here it was again, reborn in the most unexpected form. Later that morning they walked to the village together. Heads turned. Voices whispered. But Margaret didn't look away. She walked beside him, her hand light against his arm. For the first time she felt no shame, only peace. At the market they bought fresh bread and tulips. Mrs. Turner, who had always been the loudest voice in every rumor, stood behind her stall watching them. When Margaret met her eyes she smiled, not out of defiance but out of grace. The older woman blinked, then looked away. Sometimes silence speaks louder than approval. When they returned home, Daniel placed the tulips in a jar on the table. "They suit you," he said. Margaret laughed softly. "I haven't been compared to flowers in a very long time." "Then people have been blind for a very long time," he said. As days turned into weeks, the gossip faded. The world, as it always does, found new things to talk about. Some still whispered, of course, but most simply accepted what they could not understand. Life moved on quietly, beautifully. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Margaret and Daniel sat outside on the bench he had built for her. The sky was painted in shades of rose and gold. He reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. "I used to think love belonged to the young," she said after a while. "That after a certain age, it was meant to fade like everything else." "And now?" he asked. "Now I think love doesn't care how old we are. It waits, patiently, until we're brave enough to notice it." He smiled, leaning his head lightly against hers. "Then I'm glad we noticed." The evening breeze rustled through the garden, carrying with it the scent of lilacs and the sound of distant bells. She closed her eyes, feeling his warmth beside her, and thought of all the years she had lived, all the seasons that had passed without this. And yet, somehow, she knew none of it had been wasted. Every moment had led her here, to this strange, beautiful peace. As darkness settled over the valley, Daniel whispered, "Do you regret any of it?" She shook her head. "Not a second." They sat in silence, the stars coming out one by one. The world beyond their garden was still full of judgment, of noise, of time rushing ever forward. But inside their small corner of it, everything was still, complete. And in that stillness, soft, fragile, eternal, love remained.